Form elements are elements that can be used outside of a form, but they're much more useful inside of a form. These elements are typically the input element, self-closing, text area, select, and button elements. In this video, we're going to go over these very quickly, just as a quick overview, and in future videos, we're going to go over these one by one. The first one we want to go over is the input element. The input element is simply an input field. It's very small, but it's also very powerful. Now, if I just write the input, let's say we also have to add a text value here. We're saying the input type is text, and we'll get into the type in just a moment. So now I preview the page, and we have a text area. I can write in here. Now the user has some way to interact with your page. Your page is not just information going to them, they can send information back. Type has a lot of different values that we can use. Text will create a text box. Button will create a button, but we're not going to use it this time. Instead, we're going to learn about the button element. You can add a checkbox. Color. In fact, let's go over each of these so we can see what they actually look like. I'm going to start from the beginning. Text is one. Checkbox is another. We could add color. Date, those are both HTML5. Email, the browser will try to validate the email address. If you put an email address in, try to submit the form, and it's not a valid email address, your browser will say, please input a valid email address. Again, that's only HTML5. File, this is another big one. If you want to upload a particular file, you'd use type is equal to file. Hidden, this one won't show up, so we'll just see an empty line on our page. Get rid of that text since it's not applicable anymore. What about a number? We can add a number in there. Or a password. That means when someone types in that box, it's not going to show up as normal text, it'll show up as those bullet points. What about radio? We could even put the URL. There are other ones, but these are the ones that we're going to stick with right now because these are the most common ones. Now, before I view this in the browser, I'm simply going to label these. Now I view this in the browser. We have a text field. We can write in this text field. We have a checkbox. We can select a color. Again, this is only HTML5. A date. Again, this is only HTML5. Old browsers cannot deal with the color and date field. Email. It looks very much like a text field, but when you try to submit the form and it doesn't work, the form will not automatically submit. In fact, a little error will show up just above or below it. Little tooltip in your browser will say, please enter a valid email address. File, you can select a file. Hidden, nothing shows up. Number, I'm trying to type letters in here, nothing is working, but numbers will work. I can even move it up and down. Password, shows up like a normal password. Radio button, this is if you want someone to select one of multiple options. And a URL. URL, you put the exact website address in there. This is HTML5 validation. And if your browser doesn't think that it's a valid URL, it's not going to let you submit the form. Again, it's going to give you a little error above or below it, telling you to input a valid URL. Let's add a quick title here. Call them fields. And here, we're going to call these ones attributes, because that's what we're going to learn next. There are some attributes in here that you need to know. The first one is the value attribute. The value is the value that you want to put in here. So if we said text field and the value is pre-filled text, refresh our page, the text field already has text in there. It is exactly what we specified. We can select it. We can delete it. We do whatever we want to it. Another one would be, let's use it on the email, autofocus. So in HTML, we could usually just write autofocus, but because we write XHTML, which is much more strict, we type autofocus is equal to autofocus. Now, when I refresh this page, it doesn't matter what I do. It doesn't matter what field I go to. Every time I refresh the page, I'm automatically put into the email field. So I don't have to click into it. I can just start typing. That's one less step for the user. That often means they're going to fill out information a little bit quicker. There's another one for checkboxes. Check is equal to checked. So the checkbox is not checked right now, but if we refresh the page after we added that attribute, It now is. By default, it is added. Again, we can remove that if we wanted to. Now, obviously, checkboxes only work for things that you can check, such as a checkbox or a radio. And autofocus is really only used on fields that you actually input text into. Now, let's add another one. Let's disable one. We have disabled is equal to disabled. And you'll notice that the URL field here is disabled. It actually changed color a little bit, and I can't click into it. When we talk about numbers, we can add a minimum and a maximum. So min, let's say minimum is 10, and the maximum is 20. Now this one's a little bit iffy. I can put in any number by typing it. But when I use the little arrows, I can't go any higher than 20, and I can't go any lower than 10. Now if we wanted a field to be read-only, that means they cannot edit it. We use the read-only attribute. I put that on the text field. You notice when I put my mouse over a normal text field, it changes the cursor. In this case it doesn't, and when I click into it, nothing happens. I can still select the text, I just can't change any of it. That means there's a field available, but I'm only supposed to read it. As the user, I'm only supposed to read it. Another great one, placeholder. Put that one on the password, and it shows up in the background. Now it's not selectable text, and it goes away as soon as you type into it. And when there's nothing there, it automatically shows up. Placeholder, as a quick warning, doesn't always work with Internet Explorer. So sometimes when you add a placeholder for an Internet Explorer, even some of the more modern versions of Internet Explorer, it'll just show up as a blank field. So don't necessarily rely on this, but you could use this attribute as a way to improve your fields for more modern browsers. And if we wanted to add a maximum length, max length, and this works for text areas, if we want to say the maximum length is going to be 8 characters. Now if I type these numbers out, I'm pressing 9 right now and nothing is happening. Maximum characters 8. And then lastly we have autocomplete. And this one actually is not autocomplete is equal to autocomplete. It's either autocomplete is on or off. Now if you did want it on, and someone was typing their email address in, and they've typed in an email address into a similar form before, the browser is going to recognize that and try to autofill it for you. There are a couple others that I want to go over. The first one is name. This is a global attribute. And if your form method is get, the name is going to show up in the URL bar. So file would be equal to file, name is equal to hidden, or in this case just h. And what that would look like is you'd have your website.com/code.html page, and then you'd have what's called a query string. We'll talk about this later in the get video. But as a quick example, it would show up with name h is equal to whatever the value is here. So if we had a value of 123, h is equal to 123, and let's actually move this off here and put it up with the email address and say email is equal to, and whatever that value would be. So let's say the value for email address, someone put in the email address as email@email.com, and this would show up as email@email.com. So it would literally go to this page. Again, we'll talk more about that a little bit later in another video, but that's quickly what the name attribute will do. Of course, all of these can have an ID. They can all have classes. They can all have titles. These are all global attributes. Now, there is no task for this video. However, you may want to view this video just once more, even if it's on fast forward, just to get a good grip on what is going on here. There's a lot to know. There are a lot of different attributes for the single input element, and you're going to need to know, can you use a placeholder on a hidden input? Well, technically yes, but it's hidden, so it's not going to really do anything. Can you put an autofocus attribute on a radio button? Perhaps. So maybe experiment with some of that, but the most important thing to know are these attributes. And in future videos, we'll go over the different input, text area, button, and select elements individually without all these attributes, and we'll just take a look at how they actually operate inside the browser when someone is working with them, when a user is actually using these elements.